They saw a faded, jagged tattoo on a woman who didn't fit in. They saw an easy target. They didn't see the blood in the sand, the heavy breathing in the dark, or the bodies left behind. By the time the commander walked in, the joke was dead. The Crown Room at the Pacific Horizon Club smelled of old money, imported gin, and lemon polish. It was the kind of place where men in $2,000 linen suits congratulated themselves on the state of the world, overlooking the dark, rolling expanse of the Pacific Ocean. Cassidy sat at the far end of the mahogany bar. She was nursing a lukewarm club soda with a lime wedge that had seen better days. She didn't belong here. The bouncer at the front door had looked at her scuffed boots, her dark denim, and the plain black tank top with a mixture of pity and disdain, before she flashed a heavy, embossed invitation that forced him to step aside. She was 32, but her eyes looked 50. They were flat, muddy brown, and constantly moving. They tracked the waiter carrying a tray of champagne flutes. They tracked the heavy oak doors at the entrance. They tracked the subtle, shifting shadows outside the bay windows. Old habits, bad habits. Her right shoulder ached, a deep, persistent throb that hummed in time with her heartbeat. The titanium screws in her collarbone always acted up when the marine layer rolled in. To ease the tension, she rolled her shoulders back, leaning her forearms against the cool wood of the bar. When she did, the sleeve of her tank top shifted, exposing the upper half of her right bicep. The ink was not pretty. It hadn't been done in a sterile parlor in San Diego with soft music playing in the background. It had been driven into her skin by a trembling medic using a rigged Walkman motor and a guitar string in the basement of a blown-out safe house in Fallujah. It was blown out at the edges, the black ink fading to a bruised, washed-out blue. It was a bone frog. The skeletal amphibian was wrapped tightly around a broken trident. Beneath it, barely legible, were 3 tally marks. "Excuse me, barkeep, we need 2 more over here." The voice was loud. It had the grating, unearned confidence of someone who had never been punched in the mouth. Cassidy didn't turn her head, but she shifted her peripheral vision. 2 men had sidled up to the bar to her left. They smelled of expensive cologne and entitlement. One wore a pastel pink polo shirt under a navy blazer. The other had a sweater draped over his shoulders, like a country club caricature. "Make it 3, the one in the pink polo said, leaning against the bar. He looked Cassidy up and down. His eyes caught on her boots, moved up to her bare arms, and stopped abruptly. He nudged his friend. "Hey, check this out." His friend, tall, blonde, with a flush of alcohol already blooming on his cheeks, followed the gaze. A smirk slowly spread across his face. "No way," the blonde man chuckled. He leaned closer to Cassidy, invading the tight, unspoken perimeter she kept around herself. "Is that what I think it is?" Cassidy took a slow sip of her club soda. She set the glass down. The ice clinked softly. She didn't say a word. "I asked you a question, sweetheart," the blonde man said. He had a name tag clipped to his blazer. Preston. Underneath it, the logo of a major defense contractor, one of the companies that built the drones Cassidy used to call in on mountain ridges. "It's a tattoo," Cassidy said. Her voice was gravelly, quiet. "I know it's a tattoo," Preston laughed. He looked at his friend. "Trent, get a load of this. We've got a genuine operator here." Trent let out a sharp, barking laugh. "A bone frog? Seriously? Where'd you get that? A boardwalk parlor in Venice Beach? Did it come with a free surfboard?" Cassidy stared at the condensation forming on her glass. She calculated the distance between her elbow and Preston's sternum. 6 inches, a slight pivot, a sharp drive, and he'd be on the floor, gasping for air for at least 3 minutes. But she couldn't do that. Tonight wasn't about her. Tonight was about paying respects. "You guys know what that tattoo means, right?" Trent asked, taking a sip of his martini. He was playing to an imaginary audience now, raising his voice so the couple sitting 2 stools down could hear. That's a SEAL team insignia, not just the trident. The frog. It means you've seen combat. It means you've lost guys. I know what it means, Cassidy said. She finally turned to look at them. Preston laughed again, shaking his head in disbelief. Sure you do. Look, I get it. The military aesthetic is very in right now. Hell, half the girls in Pacific Beach are wearing camo jackets. But you don't mess with that specific ink. Guys die for that. It's incredibly disrespectful. Disrespectful, Cassidy repeated. Yeah. Stolen valor is a real thing, honey, Preston said, leaning closer. His breath smelled like gin and olives. It's actually illegal to pretend you're a veteran for personal gain. Not that you're getting much out of it in a place like this. You look like you took a wrong turn at the dive bar down the street. Cassidy felt the familiar, cold drip of adrenaline in her bloodstream. It was the same feeling she got sitting in the dark belly of a C-17, waiting for the red light to turn green. It stripped away the noise. It stripped away the country club, the smell of lemon polish, the clinking glasses. Everything became stark, simple. Walk away, Cassidy said. It wasn't a threat. It was a piece of advice. Trent stepped up, emboldened by the alcohol and his buddy's bravado. He actually reached out. His index finger tapped the edge of the faded black ink on her arm. Or what? Trent sneered. You gonna call in an airstrike? You gonna tell your boyfriend who actually served that some mean guys at the bar hurt your feelings? Honestly, it's pathetic. Women aren't even pulling the weight in the regular infantry, let alone Tier 1. Take a scrub brush to that thing when you get home. Cassidy didn't flinch when he touched her. She didn't move, but the air around her seemed to harden. The bartender, who had been wiping down a glass, stopped. He had worked in Coronado long enough to recognize the sudden, plunging drop in barometric pressure that preceded extreme violence. He took a slow step back. You think this is a joke? Preston announced to the small crowd that had started to notice the commotion. Several wealthy patrons in evening gowns and tuxedos paused their conversations, looking over with mild, aristocratic curiosity. We've got a fake Navy SEAL over here. Someone call the Master-at-Arms. Laughter rippled through the immediate vicinity. It was a polite, mocking sound. The kind of laughter reserved for someone who had wildly overstepped their social boundaries. Cassidy looked at her arm. She remembered the day she got the tattoo. She remembered the metallic smell of blood in the air, the heavy, suffocating heat of the Iraqi summer, and the stark white sheet covering Chief Miles's body in the corner of the room. The medic had been crying while he ran the needle. Cassidy hadn't cried. She had just sat there, letting the pain of the needle anchor her to the earth, so she wouldn't drift away into the dark. She looked back up at Preston. I'm not going to ask you again, she said. Before Preston could formulate another witty insult, the heavy double doors of the crown room opened. The heavy brass hinges let out a low groan that echoed over the quiet murmur of the club. The room changed instantly. A man walked in. He was in his late 50s, wearing immaculate navy dress blues. The gold stripes on his sleeves caught the low light. The rows of ribbons on his chest were a vibrant tapestry of overseas campaigns, valor, and survival. At the very top, unmistakable even from a distance, was the Navy Cross. It was Commander Thomas Reynolds. He was a ghost in the community, a man whose name was spoken in hushed tones in the locker rooms at BUD/S and in the briefing rooms in Virginia. He didn't just command, he had bled in the sand with the men he led. The chatter in the room died completely. Patrons stood up a little straighter. Even the wealthy civilians, who answered to no one but their shareholders, felt the gravitational pull of the man's presence. Preston and Trent immediately dropped their smirks. They straightened their posture, suddenly eager to look like the respectful, patriotic defense contractors they claimed to be on paper. Commander Reynolds paused at the entrance. His sharp, grey eyes scanned the room. He was looking for someone. "Watch this," Preston muttered to Trent, keeping his voice low. "I'm going to point her out to him. Reynolds doesn't take shit from anybody. He'll have her thrown out on the street." Reynolds began to walk. His heavy dress shoes clicked rhythmically against the hardwood floor. He was walking straight toward the bar. Preston puffed out his chest and took a step forward, directly into Reynolds's path. He put on his best, most respectful smile. "Evening, Commander," Preston said, his voice dripping with forced camaraderie. "Just wanted to say, honor to have you here. And, if you're looking to clean house tonight, you might want to look at this." Preston pointed a manicured finger directly at Cassidy, who was still sitting calmly on her stool, her back facing the door. "We caught this woman parading around with a bone frog tattoo," Preston continued, his voice rising so the surrounding room could hear his righteous indignation. "Mocking the teams, disrespecting the trident. We were just telling her she needs to leave before—" Commander Reynolds didn't even look at Preston. He didn't break his stride. He simply walked through the space Preston was occupying, forcing the younger man to stumble backward out of the way, to avoid being completely bowled over. Reynolds stopped 3 feet from the bar. He looked at the back of Cassidy's head. He looked at the scars on her neck, jagged white lines where shrapnel had dug in and never fully come out. He looked at the faded black ink on her shoulder. Cassidy slowly turned around on her stool. She looked up at the commander. He looked down at her. The silence in the room was absolute. It was thick, heavy. Preston opened his mouth to speak again, but Trent grabbed his forearm and squeezed it hard, suddenly realizing something was terribly, terribly wrong. Reynolds stood rigid. The lines on his face, carved by decades of war and the loss of good men, seemed to deepen. He didn't see a woman in a cheap tank top. He saw the Helmand province. He saw a burning Black Hawk helicopter. He saw this exact person dragging 2 200-pound men out of the wreckage by their body armor, a shattered femur grinding in her leg, returning fire with a one-handed grip on her rifle until her magazines ran dry. Reynolds's heels snapped together. The sound cracked through the quiet room like a gunshot. He straightened his back, raised his right hand, and delivered a crisp, painfully slow salute. "Chief Hollins," Commander Reynolds said. His voice was a deep rumble, thick with an emotion he rarely showed the world. It wasn't just respect, it was reverence. Cassidy looked at him for a long moment. She didn't smile. She just slowly pushed herself off the bar stool, stood up to her full height, and returned the salute. "Commander," she replied quietly. Reynolds dropped his hand. He stepped forward and did something no one in the room had ever seen the stoic commander do. He wrapped his arms around her and pulled her into a tight embrace. Cassidy hugged him back, burying her face in the shoulder of his dress blues for a fleeting second, the tension in her aching collarbone forgotten. When he pulled back, he kept his hands on her shoulders. "I didn't think you'd come," Reynolds said softly. "I told you I'd be here when you retired, sir," Cassidy said. "I don't break my promises." Reynolds finally turned his head. His eyes, suddenly hard and terrifying, locked onto Preston. Preston had gone completely pale. The flush of alcohol had vanished, replaced by the sickening hollow dread of a man who had just stepped on a landmine and heard the click. "Is there a problem here?" Reynolds asked. The question wasn't an inquiry. It was a trap. Preston's mouth opened and closed. No sound came out. Trent was actively trying to shrink into the shadows of the bar, staring at the floor, wishing the earth would open up and swallow him whole. "He was just leaving," Cassidy said. She didn't look at Preston. She didn't need to. "Weren't you?" "Yes," Preston choked out. His voice was a high-pitched croak. Yes, we were just leaving. My apologies. Ma'am, sir. Get out, Reynolds said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Preston and Trent scrambled. They didn't walk. They fled, practically tripping over their own expensive shoes as they made for the heavy oak doors, leaving their half-finished drinks sweating on the bar. The patrons in the room stared. The whispers began, hot and fast, rippling through the crowd as people tried to figure out who the woman at the bar was. The woman who had just made the most decorated officer in the room snap to attention. Reynolds turned back to the bartender, who was still standing frozen by the taps. 2 glasses, Reynolds said. Leave the bottle. The bartender, a kid no older than 22 with a fresh haircut and terrified eyes, set a bottle of heavy, dark scotch and 2 thick crystal tumblers on the mahogany. His hand trembled just enough to make the glass rattle against the wood. He didn't ask for a room tab. He didn't offer a cocktail menu. He simply backed away, melting into the shadows of the top-shelf liquor display as if his life depended on being invisible. Reynolds uncorked the bottle. The sharp, violent smell of peat and smoke cut through the cloying scent of the club's lemon polish and expensive perfume. He poured in silence. 2 fingers in each glass. No ice, no water. Just the raw, unfiltered burn. He pushed 1 glass across the polished surface. Cassidy picked it up. Her knuckles were white, the skin pulled taut over the scarred joints of her fingers. To the mud, Reynolds said. His voice was barely a rasp, pitched exclusively for her. To the mud, Cassidy echoed. They drank. The liquor traced a slow, hot path down her throat. It grounded her. It tasted like earth and ash, a fleeting sensory reminder of places entirely unlike this room with its vaulted ceilings, valet parking, and men in pink polos. Reynolds set his empty glass down with a dull thud. He leaned against the bar, mirroring her posture, staring at the rows of liquor bottles in front of them, instead of looking directly at her. In their world, direct eye contact was often an interrogation. Looking at the same horizon meant you were on the same side. "You look terrible, Cassidy," Reynolds said. Cassidy let out a short, breathy exhale that might have been a laugh. "You look like a recruitment poster, sir. They got you starched so stiff I'm surprised you can bend your knees." "It's the uniform," he replied, tugging at the cuff of his dress blues. "It hides the rot. You know that better than anyone." She did. The people in this room saw the gold stripes, the rows of colourful ribbons, the Navy Cross. They saw a hero. They didn't see the insomnia. They didn't see the prescription bottles lining his bathroom sink, or the way his left hand occasionally spasmed when the room got too quiet. They didn't know that every time he closed his eyes, he was back in a breached compound in a valley most Americans couldn't point to on a map, listening to young men bleed out over a crackling radio net. "How's the shoulder?" Reynolds asked. He didn't point to it. He just looked at the faded black ink of the bone frog resting above the joint. "It holds," Cassidy said. "Metal detectors at the airport don't care for it, but it holds." "You shouldn't be walking." The orthopedic surgeon in Landstuhl swore up and down they were going to have to amputate the leg. "Told me your femur looked like dropped porcelain." "Surgeon was a pessimist," Cassidy said flatly. She took the bottle and poured them both another measure. Besides, spite is a highly effective painkiller. Reynolds finally turned to look at her. The harsh lines of his face softened just a fraction. It was the look of a father who had sent his daughter into a burning house and had to watch her drag herself out, unrecognizable and smelling of smoke. When Cassidy had first shown up to Coronado, the instructors had laughed. The candidates had laughed. They had looked at her 5'8" frame, her quiet demeanor, and placed bets on whether she would ring the bell on Tuesday or Wednesday of Hell Week. They didn't know she had grown up pulling crab pots out of the freezing Atlantic off the coast of Maine, working until her hands bled, going home to a trailer that had no heat. They didn't know her baseline for suffering was already miles beyond their comprehension. She didn't ring the bell. She carried the heavy machine gun when the larger men's knees buckled. She tied the knots underwater when her lungs were screaming for oxygen. She broke their times, she broke their egos, and eventually she broke their biases. But Reynolds had been the one to sign the final paperwork. He had stood in front of a panel of flag officers in Washington, men who hadn't fired a weapon in anger in 20 years, and staked his entire career on her. "She goes to the Tier 1 selection," he had told them, "or I leave my trident on this desk right now." Carter would have loved this, Reynolds said suddenly. The name hung in the air, heavy and jagged. Cassidy stared into the amber liquid in her glass. She didn't blink. He would have set fire to the curtains. He would have, Reynolds agreed, a faint, genuine smile touching the corners of his mouth. Then he would have charmed the bartender into paying for the damages. They fell silent again. The chatter in the Crown Room had slowly resumed, but it was muted, respectful. The wealthy patrons had realized they were sitting adjacent to a live wire. They gave the bar a wide berth, casting nervous, sideways glances at the tall commander and the bruised, scarred woman he was treating like an equal. "I didn't think you'd actually show up," Reynolds admitted, breaking the silence. "When you discharged, you went off the grid. The command couldn't find you. I couldn't find you. I needed to breathe, Commander. The air in Virginia was getting too thin." "And did you breathe?" Cassidy thought about the cabin she had rented in Montana. The endless pine trees, the deep, suffocating quiet of the snow. The way she would wake up at 3 a.m, her hand gripping an invisible pistol, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "I survived it," she said simply. It was the most honest answer she could give. Reynolds nodded slowly. He understood the distinction. "That's why I'm getting out. 34 years. It's enough. I don't know who I am when I'm not giving orders, Cassidy. I need to figure that out before the clock runs out." The heavy double doors of the Crown Room opened again. This time it was an aide, a young lieutenant, his face flushed and anxious. He scanned the room, spotted Reynolds, and hurried over. He stopped at a respectful distance, his eyes flicking nervously toward Cassidy, unsure of how to process her presence next to the guest of honor. "Commander," the lieutenant interrupted softly. "Sir, the board members are seated. They're ready for your address in the main banquet hall. We're running about 10 minutes behind schedule." Reynolds didn't look at the aide immediately. He looked at the bottom of his glass. Then he looked at Cassidy. "You coming in?" Reynolds asked. "There's a seat at my table, front row. You can watch me try to summarize 3 decades of violence in a 15-minute speech for a room full of politicians." Cassidy offered a small, crooked smile. It was the first genuine expression she had shown all night. "With all due respect, sir, I'd rather step on a rusty nail." Reynolds let out a low rumble of a laugh. It sounded rusty, unused. "Smart girl. I always said your tactical instincts were flawless." He turned to the young lieutenant. "Give me 2 minutes, son. I'll be right there." "Yes, sir," the aide said, backing away quickly. Reynolds turned back to the bar. He reached into the breast pocket of his dress blues. He didn't pull out a challenge coin. He didn't pull out a medal. He pulled out a folded, slightly worn photograph. He slid it across the mahogany toward her. Cassidy looked down. It was a Polaroid, faded at the edges. It was the 4 of them. Reynolds in the center, looking 20 years younger. Carter on the left, grinning like an idiot, throwing a peace sign at the camera. And Cassidy on the right, her face smeared with camouflage paint, holding a sniper rifle across her chest, looking exhausted but fiercely, undeniably alive. "I carried that in my plate carrier for the last 2 deployments," Reynolds said. His voice had dropped again, returning to that gravelly intimacy. "It kept me anchored. I want you to have it." Cassidy reached out. Her fingers traced the rough edge of the Polaroid. She didn't say thank you. The words were too small, too civilian for what the gesture actually meant. She just carefully folded it and slid it into the front pocket of her jeans. "You earned the ink, Cassidy," Reynolds said, his eyes locking onto hers, forcing her to look up. He wasn't speaking as a friend now. He was speaking as a commander, the voice of absolute authority. "Every damn drop of blood, every piece of metal in your body, you earned it. Never let a man in a pink polo shirt tell you what the weather feels like when he's never been out in the storm. You hear me?" "I hear you, sir," she whispered. Reynolds nodded. He straightened his uniform, squaring his broad shoulders. He tapped his knuckles twice against the bar, a final sign-off, and turned. The crowd parted for him instantly. He didn't look back as he followed the aide out of the crown room, the heavy oak doors swallowing him into the bright lights and applause of the banquet hall. Cassidy sat alone at the bar for another minute. The silence around her felt different now. It wasn't the silence of isolation. It was the silence of armor dropping to the floor. She stood up. Her right knee clicked sharply. Her shoulder ached. She felt every one of her 32 years and the ghost of 50 more. She turned and began to walk toward the exit. She didn't strut. She didn't glare at the crowd. She walked with the slow, deliberate, heavy gait of someone who carried an invisible mountain on her back. The men in linen suits and the women in evening gowns stopped talking as she passed. They moved out of her way, pulling their drinks close to their chests. They looked at her boots. They looked at her scars. They looked at the faded, skeletal frog on her arm. They didn't laugh anymore. When she reached the entrance, the bouncer, the same man who had sneered at her denim and tank top an hour ago, rushed forward. He practically threw his weight against the heavy brass handles, pulling the door wide open for her, his head bowed in a posture of rigid respect. Cassidy stepped through the threshold. The cold, damp marine layer rolled off the Pacific Ocean and hit her face. It smelled of salt, dark water, and distance. She took a slow, deep breath, letting the ocean air fill her lungs, and walked out into the San Diego fog, disappearing into the night. If you felt the weight of Chief Hollins's journey and appreciate stories that honor the silent, grueling sacrifices of those who serve, please hit the like button. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that true strength never has to shout to be heard. Subscribe to our channel for more grounded, deeply human stories about the unseen battles fought every day. Your support helps us bring authentic, powerful narratives to life. Thank you for watching.